All right. Hello, everyone. Where are my captions? There they are. Okay. We are just starting into the last section in Forbidden Religion, and I think there are 7 articles left, and the last one is pretty long, so I may end up doing it by itself. But I'm going to go for 2 and see how I feel. Maybe I'll do 3, just depending on how my voice holds out tonight. But we are starting in the section is called The Spirit and the Soul. And the first one in the section is Article 34, The Casting Out of Evil Spirits. So, a pioneering psychotherapist points her profession back to its roots, by Cynthia Logan. Not sure why I'm coughing all of a sudden. All right. Try not to do too much of that. Remember The Exorcist and its chilling scenes that caused various reactions among audiences? Whereas some enjoyed the intense effects and dismissed the film as mere entertainment, many experienced an uncomfortable encounter with energies we would like to relegate to Hollywood's active imagination, but can't. Indeed, there is ample evidence that evil manifests on Earth, acting through humans, animals, and nature itself. From swine trapped in the body of a demented man, cast out by Jesus, to heartless, senseless murder and twisted tortures all over the globe, Satan shows his face. And it's not just the gross deviations that constitute evil. A growing number of people say They are experiencing demonic possession in subtle ways that manifest as various physical, mental, and emotional symptoms and conditions. For them, phrases such as, quote, the devil made me do it, end quote, and he's wrestling with his demons, and what possessed you to do that, are more than mere adages. These people are sure they are being influenced by demons, and after trying conventional means, many are turning to Dr. Shakuntala Modi for spirit releasement. Modi, a board-certified psychiatrist practicing in Wheeling, West Virginia, notes that while seemingly New Age spirit releasement has a significant history, quote, the earliest evidence of the need to deal with spirits in the work is the work of primitive medicine men or shamans. Later, the medicine men emerged using prayers, herbs, drinks, and music to induce the spiritual awareness necessary to ward off evil spirits. The Greeks and Romans believed mania to be possession by evil spirits who represented the cult of the dead. End quote. Interestingly, by contrast, the Arabs believed the insane to be sent by God to tell the truth and worship them as saints. Interesting. All right. According to Modi, the history of psychiatry traces a backward movement. Quote, over the years, psychiatrists have wandered down countless blind alleys looking for alternative, more scientific answers to mental illness than those purported by the ancients, she says. Today, the mental health community is coming full circle back to the understandings of their early counterparts, such as Plato, who described madness as a state in which the wanting soul loses the thinking soul, causing people to act against their rational natures. End quote. Dr. Modi's own history began in central India. As a child, she lost her father and was raised by an uncle along with her siblings and cousins. She wanted to become a doctor for as long as she could remember. When family finances became such that only she or her brother could become a doctor, her brother sacrificed his own ambition so that she could achieve hers. An astounding act considering the country's gender prejudice. Modi became an obstetrician gynecologist and married a general surgeon. Their son, Raju, was born in India. When they moved to America, Modi realized that without the extended family system they had enjoyed in India, either she or her husband would have to make a career change. Quote, I had been interested in psychiatry and thought it would be a way I could be a working mother. End quote. She says. After graduate school, she practiced traditional psychiatry using hypnotherapy as an adjunct. She earned an excellent reputation among her peers and enjoyed hospital admittance privileges. In 1988, her practice began a radical evolution. She became aware of the concept of past life regression. When a patient suffering with claustrophobia instantly regressed to another life in which she was being buried alive. After the session, the patient was relieved of her long-standing and disabling condition. These results are what kept Dr. Modi pursuing what she often calls God's work, which forms the collection of case studies in her popular book, Remarkable Healings. Replete with case histories, the book details the stories of patient after patient describing similar phenomena. Quote, the results speak for themselves, she says. People are getting well, their symptoms are clearing, and they are able to resume normal lives. End quote. According to Modi, relief is often immediate and dramatic, with patients reporting that they feel more alive and energetic than ever before, or light and empty, as if a great weight had been lifted from them. Others say they can breathe more easily and that relationships have improved. Modi emphasizes that hypnotism is not the dramatic, induced state we stereotypically think of. It is rather a parallel awareness, achieved when we focus our concentration deeply and slip into fantasy, or become so absorbed in conversation that we tune out those around us. Quote, "The subconscious contains the soul memories of every lifetime," says Modi. "Everything we have ever touched, sensed, smelled, felt, heard, experienced, and done is recorded not only from our current lifetime, but from all past lives, the time between incarnations, and even from the time of our soul's creation and the creation of the universe." End quote. And there is a picture of Dr. Shakuntala Modi. If you're interested. I've shown all the other pictures, so I might as well show that one. All right. While the subconscious can bring up these memories, Modi feels it is vital to include the conscious mind as well. She deliberately avoids using classic relaxation techniques associated with hypnotism, such as counting backwards and suggestions that the patient is becoming sleepy. Quote, "Learning takes place consciously," she says emphatically. "We need to be consciously aware of what's going on, not push the memories back into the subconscious." End quote. According to hypnotized patients, some people have firm boundaries around their energy field or aura, as if they are heavily armored. This boundary prevents outside spirits from entering them. Other people have soft, porous, fuzzy boundaries, making it easier for the spirits to penetrate their shields and bodies. Different physical and emotional conditions, behaviors, and situations can open one to psychic possession. Quote, "We are most vulnerable when ill, injured, unconscious, sedated, or anesthetized." End quote, says Modi. Playing with conjuring games such as Dungeons and Dragons, using a Ouija board, engaging in automatic writing, or channeling can also invite unwanted quote-unquote guests. Really? Come on, guys. I mean, for D&D, yeah, I would beg to differ on that one. Although there are people that have gone off the deep end, gotten too much into it. It's scary stuff. And as if we don't have plenty to deal with during birth and present life trauma, Modi says our souls can fragment, leaving a core self bereft of various parts that took off during past or present life trauma, or left to help or stay with a deceased loved one. We can also be possessed by earthbound spirits or by demon entities who can plant false past life memories within us. Even worse, they claim to implant mechanical devices that interfere with heavenly guidance and influence us negatively, as Modi's patient Josephine, who had severe bulimia, experienced. According to her, dark beings would project a food commercial through devices implanted over her mind that would cause her to think about those foods and then consume them until she would throw up. Other patients described devices that pushed, pulled, or applied pressure to various organs and tissues in their bodies. They claimed these devices were either active or passive physical displacement devices, each tailored specifically to achieve a particular aim, such as throwing off a joint by a fraction, putting pressure on a nerve, or squeezing two bones tightly so that they would grate and scrape together. Other devices discovered were, quote, "focusing and amplifying devices," end quote, such as a focusing dish or wave machine, and quote-unquote black energy absorbers that, rather than cause active pain, induced a state of chronic fatigue. I'm all out of focus, apparently. Hello? There we go. Okay. Though demons are deliberate and diabolical, Modi advocates practicing releasement with compassion. Quote, I actually treat the entity as a secondary patient, she says, end quote. According to her, even the darkest spirit can be transformed and released into the light. She notes a distinction between exorcism and releasement. Quote, exorcism is a religious ritual marked by the forceful expulsion of a demon entity. It is a confrontational, wrenching, and physically and emotionally exhausting to the exorcist and to the subject. It directs judgment upon the entity itself, damning it and casting it out. It can be grabbed by Satan and brutally punished. It can go to another host, or it can return to the person from whom it was cast out. End quote. Modi cautions that before considering spirit releasement, potential patients should rule out biochemical causes and organic brain disorders, such as those that have been clearly implicated in schizophrenia. It's a soft, calm voice that people are turning to help them cast out demons. Modi's Indian accent adds a melodious quality to a quiet, reverent tone. A typical session involving past life regression includes the following steps: grounding and identification, during which patients are asked to look at their feet and describe what they are wearing, which leads to a recognition of who they are in that current life, processing the traumatic event that comes up from that life, during which Dr. Modi guides her patients through their event, encouraging them to recall, relive, and release the trauma completely, undergoing the process of death, the transition to heaven, and experiences in the light. These experiences are commonly reported to consist of being greeted by light beings, um, quote unquote ventilation, where the people undergoing the therapy may be invited to vent pent up emotions, soul cleansing, a life review, an opportunity to recognize other people and to make connections between the past and current life, and an opportunity to forgive others as well as oneself. Quote, forgiving yourself for hurting others is the most difficult step in forgiveness, says Modi. When I ask patients to look back and see when they were hurting someone, they almost always say they see demon entities telling them and pushing them to do the wrong things. End quote. After these experiences are completed, Modi moves on to locating, retrieving, and integrating fragmented soul parts, integrating the past life personality. Modi says that her patients often describe heaven as a sphere with two sections. Quote, the outer section is like the porch of a house where things are in an earthly form. After cleansing, reviewing, and resting, the soul goes down a pathway into the gate of an inner section where everything is in spiritual form. End quote. Here, patients say that they learn, have discussions with others, and plan for the next life. This planning includes personal and group goals. Once cleared of past life trauma or entity/demon possession, patients are counseled to stay in the light through a protection prayer given twice daily. Modi suggests her patients request their angels to quote, remove all the earthbound demons and other entities, dark shields, dark energies, dark devices, and dark connections from my body, aura, soul, and silver cord, and also from my home, workplace, car, and places of recreation. Then ask them to fill and shield you in a bubble of light and reflective spiritual mirrors. You and only you have a right to live in your body/mind. End quote. While Modi feels that she believes while Modi feels that she enjoys a fully integrated, entity-free soul, she refuses to take on the role of healer insisting that she is a researcher, simply reporting what her patients tell her. She is careful to make this distinction so that the work is presented objectively and will withstand the rigors of scientific scrutiny. So far, her work hasn't come under the microscope. Quote, "Those who are ready to see embrace this work," she says, "while those who are not ready don't understand it." End quote. She says that her husband and son, both physicians, quote unquote, sort of understand. Her work is a consuming passion, and Modi, who doesn't own a computer, spent hundreds of hours writing remarkable healings in longhand, as she does each of her case studies. Quote, "I don't want to entrust this to anyone else to transcribe," she says. Despite what she calls, quote unquote, serious writer's block, she is working on a second book due out next year, which will consider the nature of God and creation itself. It will be very exciting, she promises. Modi cautions that her current book is not a how-to manual for lay people. She suggests contacting the Association for Past Life Research and Therapies, Incorporated, and gives their address and phone number as a reference. The book, though it's becoming a Bible of sorts, passes from hand to hand. It is a catalyst for calls that Modi is getting from all over the world. Quote, "People come and stay a week or so for intensive therapy," she says, end quote, end quote. Freeing oneself of spirit entities does not come cheap. Modi charges the going rate of $150 per hour, and sessions usually last from 3 to 6 hours. Multiply that by 10 or 12 sessions, you're likely to need, and you've got a bill of between $4,000 and $5,000. But as Modi points out, that's often much less than what people spend on medical treatments over a longer period without benefit of the clear healing that her shorter intensive work seems to offer. Though she hasn't conducted any formal studies of long-term cures, Modi has compiled tables comparing primary and secondary emotional and physical symptoms of patients. After hundreds of quote-unquote remarkable healings, Modi has concluded, quote, "Every disease is a disease of the soul, and with God's help we can cure anything," end quote, and end article. I'm always extremely skeptical of people that talk about past life regression and soul releasement. I've heard of it before. I haven't read a whole lot about it, but I'm always just very, very skeptical because it's so easy to fake a lot of it and to convince people that you've done something for them that you really haven't. So I take people like her with a huge grain of salt. Not saying it's not possible. I'm just saying I'm very, very skeptical of people who claim that they can do stuff like that. And it's because of all of the bad actors out there that have claimed it and just been scamming people. And, I mean, she's charging $4 or $5 grand. Okay. Hope people are getting their money's worth. My hope is that they're getting exactly what she claims they're getting. All right, moving on. Article 35, the paranormal autobiography of Benvenuto Cellini. Did Cosmic Forces Rescue the Great Renaissance Goldsmith? By John Chambers. We've got a few pictures in this one, so it'll be relatively short as far as reading. Okay, on a gloomy day in mid-May 1539, Benvenuto Cellini, Italy's greatest goldsmith, lay on a dank pallet in a dungeon in the castle of Sant'Angelo in Rome and decided to commit suicide. He had already escaped from his dungeon once by lowering himself down the castle wall on a rope made of strips of bed sheets, breaking his leg at the bottom. He managed to crawl to the house of an eminent friend, but almost immediately was betrayed and hustled back into prison. This time he'd been flung into a dungeon far worse than the last, so deep and dark that his mattresses were already soaked through with seeping water where the sunlight filtered down from the slit of a window for only an hour and a half a day. Large spiders and venomous worms were everywhere. Because of his broken leg, he had to crawl to the side of the cell to relieve himself. For a man of Cellini's active, exuberant, even volcanic temperament, this was a living hell. He decided to end his life, but in this starkly empty cubicle, it was hard to figure out how. He looked around, then, as he later wrote in his autobiography, quote, I took and propped a wooden pole I found there in position like a trap. I meant to make it topple over on my head, and it would certainly have dashed my brains out. But when I had arranged the whole machine, and was approaching to put it in motion, just at the moment of my setting my hand to it, I was seized by an invisible power and flung 4 cubits, 6 feet, from the spot, in such a terror that I lay half dead. Like that I remained from dawn until the 19th hour, when they brought my food. End quote. When Cellini awoke, priests were standing over him. He had been taken for dead. The prison warden, or castellan, taking pity on Cellini, sent him a new mattress. He tells us that lying on the mattress that night, quote, when I searched my memory to find what could have diverted me from that design of suicide, I came to the conclusion that it must have been power divine and my good guardian angel. End quote. An incredible dream that night seemed to support his conclusion. He encountered, quote, a marvelous being in the form of a most lovely youth who cried as though he wanted to reprove me. And there a quote inside the quote, knowest thou who lent thee that body which thou wouldst have spoiled before its time? End quote within the quote and the quote, if that makes sense. I don't know how to read that otherwise. Cellini replied that he, quote, recognized all things pertaining to me as gifts from the God of nature. The beautiful youth rejoined, thou hast contempt for his handiwork, through this thy will to spoil it. Commit thyself unto his guidance, and lose not hope in his great goodness. End quote. There was much more, Cellini tells us, quote, in words of marvelous efficacy, the 1,000th part of which I cannot now remember. End quote. The dream encounter galvanized Cellini into a frenzy of creative activity. He mixed crumbled stone with his urine to make ink. He chewed a splinter off the cell door to make a pen. He wrote a long poem in the margins of his Bible, describing his body, chastising his soul for wanting to leave too early. This brought him around to reading his Bible. Cellini became captivated by what he read. Quote, with profound astonishment, he writes, I dwelt upon the force of God's Spirit in those men of great simplicity who believed so fervently that he would bring all their heart's desires to pass. End quote. The prisoner Goldsmith decided to imitate these men. Then he writes, quote, there flowed into my soul so powerful a delight from these reflections upon God that I took no further thought for all the anguish I had suffered, but rather spent the day in singing psalms and diverse other compositions on the theme. I don't know why that didn't register. Diverse other compositions on the theme of his divinity. End quote. Cellini's captivity in the castle of Sant'Angelo was far from over. There would be other desperate situations, but for each one there would be another seemingly miraculous intervention. Finally, a frail but fiercely joyous Cellini would stand outside the prison, a free man as well as a celebrated craftsman in the boisterous, brilliant final decades of the great Italian Renaissance. The presence of divine protection in his life seems to have been announced from the start to Benvenuto Cellini, who was born in Florence in 1500 and died there in 1571. At the age of 3, he picked up a deadly scorpion and, unaware of its danger, held it in his hands. Only after his father declawed it in his hands would the little boy somehow, unharmed, let it go. Afterward, the family, quote unquote, took the occurrence for a good augury. When Cellini was 5, his father spotted a salamander, quote, sporting in the intensest coals in the fireplace, and called Cellini over to see it. At that time, it was thought that salamanders lived in fire, and it was considered a rare miracle to see one doing so. It's likely Cellini even ever after regarded this encounter as symbolic of his own unique ability to pass unscathed through the fire of life's disasters. Apprenticed to the most illustrious goldsmiths of the day, Cellini acquired a reputation as a gifted and original craftsman. The belligerent goldsmith also acquired a reputation as a brawler. He never stopped quarreling with the rich, the powerful, and anyone who came along. He even committed, for good reason he told himself, the occasional murder. His defiant, hot-headed, self-righteous, and difficult nature led to his frequent banishment from city after city. Throughout his life, he crisscrossed Italy, even spending some time in France. As a sought-after and brilliantly productive craftsman, creating objets d'art, I know I didn't pronounce that right, coinage, medals, medallions, and the occasional sculpture for patrons in both civil and religious arenas. And now we have a picture. And I'll go ahead and show 2 pictures, because why not? Cellini's famous gold, ebony, and enamel salt cellar depicting Neptune and a reclining woman. Okay. There we go. I hope you can see that well enough. And then the other one is of Cellini himself, a portrait of Renaissance goldsmith Benvenuto Cellini. So I'll just show you that one real quick. All right. Always the supernatural never seemed far off. In the deserted Roman Colosseum one midnight in 1532, he actively solicited the supernatural. With a professional necromancer, 2 assistants, and a virginal 12-year-old boy meant to seduce the deceased, the audacious goldsmith tried to summon the spirits of the dead. Cellini only wanted to ask if he would see his girlfriend, the prostitute Angelina, again. He was told he would in 1 month, and this came true. For their trouble, the ghost hunters were rewarded with a vision of 1,000,000 howling demons and the Colosseum in flames. Hallucination or not, the adventurers ran home screaming, or so Cellini tells us in his autobiography. In 1535, the craftsman/author became deathly ill, hovering between life and death for weeks. During this time, it seemed to him that he was wrestling every night with the actual Charon, the boatman of Greek myth said to ferry the souls of the dead across the river Styx to the afterworld. Cellini wrote, quote, "The terrible old man used to come to my bedside and make as though he would drag me by force into a huge boat he had with him." End quote. Even as Cellini described the apparition to a friend, quote, "The old man took me by the arm and dragged me violently towards him. This made me cry out for aid because he was going to fling me under hatches in his hideous boat." End quote. Cellini finally began to recover his health, and it was only then that, quote, that old man ceased to give so much annoyance, yet sometimes he appeared to me in dreams, end quote. Cellini did not back away from quarreling with the most powerful man in Italy and the goldsmith's employer for a while, Pope Clement VII. This is probably why in 1538, most likely on trumped-up charges, he was imprisoned in the castle of Sant'Angelo. His miraculous rescue from suicide by the intercession of a guardian angel didn't mark the end of his difficulties. The Castellan, curious that Cellini was more joyful than the Castellan himself, ordered that the prisoner be flung into an even deeper dungeon. So roughly was Cellini carted towards this dungeon, his broken leg having healed, he tells us, because he, quote, had so often dreamed that angels came and ministered to me, end quote, that he feared he would be thrown into the infamous oubliette of Samabo, where men plummeted, quote, to the bottom of a deep pit in the foundations of the castle, end quote. Ending up in just another dungeon, Cellini became so joyful that, quote, during the whole of the first day I kept festival with God, my heart rejoicing ever in the strength of hope and faith, end quote. I like reading this, but there's so damn many quotes, it's a little annoying. The Castellan was beside himself. He had Cellini carted back to his old cell and issued an order for Cellini's execution, making sure word got back to Cellini. Hearing this was too much, even for Cellini's mighty spirit. He decided for a second time to kill himself. Quote, at this juncture, he wrote, the invisible being who had diverted me from my intention of suicide came to me, being still invisible, but with clear voice, and shook me, and made me rise, and said to me, ah me, my Benvenuto, quick, quick, betake thyself to God with thy accustomed prayers, and cry out loudly, loudly. In a sudden consternation, writes Cellini, I fell upon my knees and recited several of my prayers in a loud voice. After this I said, Que habitat in adjutorio. Then I communed a space with God, and in an instant the same clear and open voice said to me, go to rest and have no further fear. End quote. The next day, inexplicably, even to the Castellan himself, the Castellan cancelled the order for Cellini's execution. Cellini rejoiced with even greater fervor now, working himself into a most exalted state of altered consciousness. The stage was set for another encounter with the supernatural. He had been begging his guardian angel, whom he considered to be always present, to give him just one last look at the sun. Waking up one morning to a particularly dark dungeon, Cellini beseeched God himself to grant him such a favor. Immediately his invisible angel, quote, like a whirlwind, caught me up and bore me away into a large room, where he made himself visible to my eyes in human form, appearing like a young man whose beard is just growing, with a face of indescribable beauty, but austere, not wanton, end quote. Cellini was led through a quote-unquote little low door into a narrow street and told to climb up a huge spiral staircase. As he ascended, the goldsmith found himself coming, quote, within the region of the sunlight until I discovered the whole sphere of the sun. The strength of his rays, as is their wont, first made me close my eyes, but becoming aware of my misdoing, I opened them wide, and gazing steadfastly at the sun, exclaimed, O my son, for whom I have so passionately yearned, albeit your rays may blind me, I do not wish to look on anything again but this. End quote. The rays spread to one side, and as Cellini watched, quote, see, it's kind of becoming annoying, all these quotes. I'm sorry, it just is. A Christ upon the cross formed itself out of the same substance as the sun, end quote. Next, a Madonna appeared holding a child and escorted by two, quote unquote, indescribably beautiful angels. Quote, the marvelous apparition remained before me little more than half a quarter of an hour when it dissolved and I was carried back to my dark lair, end quote, writes Cellini. He had brought back with him a souvenir from this marvelous out-of-body journey to the sun, a permanent halo around his head. This aureole of glory, Cellini declared, is visible to every sort of man to whom I have chosen to point it out, but those have been very few. Hey, Third String Gamer, nice to have you stop by. Thank you. I'm sorry you came in 10 minutes ago and I'm just barely noticing it. I was caught up in the book. Um, but thank you for stopping by. Perhaps the Castellan saw the halo and was rebuked. Very soon afterward, Cellini was released. The goldsmith's author continued to be borne up by the supernatural, but his angelic guardians never showed themselves to greater advantage than when they rescued his greatest work of art from certain disaster. Cellini's finest artistic achievement is arguably his Perseus holding the head of Medusa, 1545 to 1554. A larger-than-life-sized bronze statue which still stands today in the Loggia de Lanzi in Florence. No one thought that Cellini would be able to cast a bronze statue of such enormous size, 18 feet in height, including the pedestal. Not only did the technology for such a feat scarcely exist in 16th century Italy, but also Cellini's enemies were actively scheming to sabotage the work. In the final weeks of this great endeavor, with the aid of 10 assistants, Cellini constructed a huge and highly innovative furnace around the baked clay and wax prototype of the Perseus. In the final hours of casting, after the most strenuous exertions, and just as the casting furnace was starting to liquefy the bronze, Cellini felt himself seized by a fever, quote, of the utmost possible intensity, end quote. Certain he'd be dead by morning, he dragged himself to bed, reluctantly leaving the hugely difficult final stage in the hands of his assistants. Cellini spent the next 2 hours, quote, battling with the fever, which steadily increased, and calling out continually, I feel that I am dying, end quote. While his despairing housekeeper fought to hide her tears, suddenly Cellini writes, quote, I beheld the figure of a man enter my chamber, twisted in his body into the form of a capital S. He raised a lamentable, doleful voice like one who announces their last hour to men condemned to die upon the scaffold, and spoke these words, O Benvenuto, your statue is spoiled, and there is no hope whatever of saving it, end quote. Now, I'm almost done with the article, but there's one more picture, and it is of the Perseus statue. So it says, a triumphant Perseus holds up the severed head of Medusa in this 18-foot high statue by Cellini. So let me show you that. 18 feet high. Oop, 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 oop. There we go. Okay. And now we'll finish up the article. Howling with rage at these words, Cellini leapt out of bed, pulled on his clothes, and raced for the workshop. He found his assistants standing around morosely. Through some disaster, the molten bronze was beginning to coagulate in the furnace. Cellini was certain one of the assistants was trying to sabotage his masterpiece. He seized control of events with Herculean force. Loads of highly combustible oak wood were rushed from across the street and tossed into the furnace. The furnace blazed up again, and the bronze began to melt. Icy rain from a storm outside threatened to cool the furnace again. Cellini had all the doors, windows, chinks, and crannies in the house blocked up with rugs and curtains. There was a sudden explosion and a tremendous burst of flame. The cap of the furnace had blown off, and the molten bronze bubbled out. All seemed lost until Cellini, in a furious burst of inspiration, had his assistants throw every one of his 200 pewter pots, pans, and plates into the furnace. The stratagem worked. The bronze began to liquefy, and soon the entire statue had been cast to perfection. Amazingly, every ounce of bronze had been used, with nothing left, and the entire statue had been formed, all except the tip of Perseus's right big toe. Not only had Cellini not succumbed to the fever, but he had never felt better. Had the apparition of the S-shaped man been one more manifestation of his guardian angel? Had it been Cellini's endlessly powerful creative imagination? Or, as his housekeeper suggested happily to Cellini, had the kicks and blows rained on his staff while, in a towering rage, he had what? Or, as his housekeeper suggested happily to Cellini, had the kicks and blows rained on his staff while, in a towering rage, he raced back to his workshop, frightened away the lethal fever. Whatever the explanation, Cellini would write in commemoration of that frenzied hour, quote, "I cannot remember a day in my whole life when I dined with greater gladness or a greater appetite." End quote. And that is the end of that article, and I think I'm going to call it there. I'm starting to stumble, so it's a good time to stop. The next article is Dostoevsky and spiritualism, and then after that, Victor Hugo and the spirits. So we'll do at least those two next time, and then we've got 38, 39, and 40. I think there's 40. Yeah. So, yeah, we've got 5 articles left. We'll figure out how we're going to do 3 in one and then 2 in the other, I think. I'll look ahead and see which are the shorter ones, and even if I have to go out of order, I'll lump them together. But anyway, that'll be that for tonight. Let's see if anyone's around to raid. I don't plan on gaming tonight. Well, you never know. It's still early enough. I might change my mind. Old World Charm is playing D&D, if anybody's interested. I'm always interested in that. Resident Evil 4, Rengoku is playing. Yeah, Supeda Play. I haven't been to Supeda Plays in a while. Let's go to that channel. World of Warcraft. So if you'll bear with me a minute, we'll get on over there. I'll see you there.